Today we're talking about adding integers, and we're going to break this up into two ideas. The first idea is how to add integers when both of the integers have the same sign. And then after that we'll talk about adding integers when they have different signs. So let's start with integers with the same sign. Whenever you add integers that have the same sign, then you're going to add the numbers and keep the sign. So we have that written over here. Add the numbers and keep the sign. For example, 5 plus 7 means we have 5 positives and 7 positives. So we're going to add 5 plus 7 to get 12. And since we have positives plus positives, we just end up with a whole bunch of positives. So it's a positive 12. Then we have negative 3 plus negative 6. So we're going to add the numbers. 3 plus 6 is 9 and keep the sign. They're both negative, so the answer is negative. And I always think about this as I have some negatives, I add more negatives to it, so I end up with a whole bunch of negatives. Next, we're going to talk about adding with different signs. So in the case of having different signs, we have to actually subtract the numbers and keep the sign of whichever we have the most of. We'll see some examples as to why this works, but basically what you're doing is you're canceling the positives and negatives, and then whichever sign you have more of, that's what you're left with. So for example, these 4 negatives and these 2 positives are going to cancel 2 of those negatives, so you're left with 2 negatives. So our answer is negative 2. So we subtracted 4 minus 2 to get 2, and we had more negatives than positives, so our answer is going to be negative. With 5 plus negative 7, we're going to cancel these 5 positives with 5 negatives, and we're left with 2 negatives after we cancel those 5. So our answer is negative 2. Again, 7 minus 5 is 2, and we have more negatives than positives. In this last example, we have 50 plus negative 30. Well, we're going to take these 30 negatives and cancel it with 30 positives, and we'll be left with 20 positives. So our answer is positive 20, or just 20. So 50 plus negative 30 is the same as 50 minus 30, which gives us 20, and then we have more positives than negatives, so it's positive. Let's look at some examples as to how this works out. So we're going to work with same signs, both as the idea of using a number line and with the idea of using integer chips. Let's start with the number line. So if we want to use the number line technique, we always start at 0 or home, and then we move however many places the first number in our problem tells us to move, and then the sign tells us which direction to move in. So we're going to move 4 places in the negative direction. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then we're going to move 2 places in the negative direction, since that's our next number. So we're going to move 1, 2, and I don't have a negative 6 written here, but that would land us on negative 6. Therefore, negative 4 plus negative 2 equals negative 6. So the number line technique is a nice technique to use. Now we're going to move on to integer chips, which is just another technique to show the same idea. Here we have 4 negatives, so I'm going to drag out 4 negative chips. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then I'm adding to that 2 more negatives. So I'm just going to bring up 2 more negative chips. 1, 2. So altogether I have 6 negative chips. So my answer is negative 6. Either technique is fine. Pick one that works for you, or you can go back and forth. So now let's try different signs. So remember, I said with different signs, what do? You subtract the numbers and you keep the sign of whichever you have more of, right? So that's a little bit trickier than just adding. So again, we're going to start with the number line, and on the number line you always start at 0, which is your home, and you move however many spaces that first number tells you to move, which is 3 in this situation, and you're going to move in the negative direction. So we're going to move 1, 2, 3 to negative 3. Then we're going to move 5 in the positive direction. So we're going to turn around from negative 3 and move 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in the positive direction, and that lands us on 2. So since we end up on 2, our answer is 2. Again, we're subtracting the numbers. 5 minus 3 is 2, and we have more positives than negatives, so it's a positive 2. Going down to use the integer chip model, we're going to drag out negative 3. So we're going to drag out 3 negatives, and we want to keep in mind that negatives and positives cancel each other. That's really important. Anytime you have a positive and negative together, they actually cancel each other to equal 0. That's referred to as a zero pair. So I dragged out my 3 negatives. Now I'm going to drag out my 5 positives. One, I'm going to line them up on top of each other because every time we have a negative and a positive, that equals 0 or gives us a 0 pair. So here, I'm going to see that a positive and a negative cancel to give me 0. Positive and a negative cancel to give me 0. Positive and a negative cancel to give me 0. And I'm left with 2 positives. So my answer is 2. I'd like for you to try these problems 1 through 5. You can use either one of the techniques I've showed you, or you may already have it down well enough to not need to use the techniques, but take a minute and try these problems. Pause the video and try these problems, and then unpause it when you're done. Number 1, we have negative plus a negative, so we're going to have a whole bunch of negatives. So that's going to equal negative 13. Number 2, we have a positive plus a negative. Since they're different signs, we know that these 4 positives are going to cancel 4 of those negatives, and we're left with 4 negatives. So our answer is negative 4, or we subtracted 8 minus 4 to get 4, and we had more negatives than positives, so the answer is negative. Number 3, again, we're going to cancel these 2 positives with 2 of those negatives, so we're left with 4 negatives, so we end up with negative 4, or 6 minus 2 is 4, and we have more negatives than positives. 2 plus 3 is obviously just 5, but it's the idea that we want to repeat. We have positives plus positives, we add them, and we end up with a whole bunch of positives. And then we're going to add 9 plus negative 6. These 6 negatives cancel with 6 of the negatives in our 9, so we're left, or 6 of the positives in our 9, so we're left with 3 positives. In other words, 9 minus 6 is 3, and we have more positives than negatives.